Hi, this is Feng Chen, and I will be presenting Chapter 8 in the Johnston book about ethics, rights, and values. Ethics and ethical communities. Ethics are contingencies within a community that governs how we behave. In other words, it is a behavioral practice that deals with how we interact with each other. Ethical behavior is therefore how each individual influences each other's behavior. An example is treating elders with respect, which is valued in some communities. This behavior, or the absence of it, will have contingencies that strengthen or weaken it. Contingencies define ethical values, not that values drive contingencies. Ethical standards are regulated by social contingencies, otherwise known as rules, that describe behavior in which the community judges as appropriate or inappropriate. Ethical standards indicate how we behave toward each other. Some standards are derived from governmental laws or formal laws, but most are informal. These standards also involve behavior that has an adverse effect on others. An example is witnessing or learning about animal cruelty. Even though this behavior is not in relation to how we treat each other, it may bring forth social disapproval in many forms. Air or water pollution are examples of behavior that has an adverse impact on the environment, which may also be subject for social disapproval. Ethical communities are a body of members that reinforce or punish certain behavioral practices. What are rights? Rights are verbal behavior. We talk about our rights to determine how to obtain reinforcement or avoid punishment through individuals or things. An example is saying we have a right to eat unhealthy food. This behavior is reinforcing, and others may interfere in our eating habits only with our permission. Another example is the right to use our body however way we desire. The underlying idea is that we control access to these contingencies, and if others want to be involved in the process, they must also be granted permission. Similarly, our rights are denied when faced with an adverse treatment. An example is a robber who steals your money at gunpoint. Our rights to our personal possession is violated when the robber steals the money. Right statements are verbal behavior that can best be understood by its controlling contingencies. Right statements are also commands that imply the conditions of deprivation or aversive stimulation by the individual and indicate the consequences that will be resolved, making it reinforcing. For example, stating that you have a right to go to the movies without others texting on their cell phones, you are mandating that others should not participate in aversive activities. Right statements can also be tax, which is sparked by objects or conditions of the environment. When you tact, you are stating that it is a specific right and that it is supported by the ethical community. And where do these rights come from? Right statements come from our ethical communities. It is the same communities where we grew up learning our verbal repertoire. We attain experience with our contingencies that drive our rights statements. Being a member of a company or organization, we learn about our rights concerning employment and benefits. It is only the members within the community that dictate what our rights are. Our statements and behavior concerning rights are controlled by the ethical communities that we are a part of. Only through the ethical communities that we find our support for our rights. Values. Values are descriptions of our behavior, or the behavior of others in different environmental circumstances. For example, the golden rule that we should treat others the way we want to be treated is not just a description of desired behavior in ourselves or others, but also desired social reinforcement contingencies. Similar to rights, values indicate appropriate behavior that is controlled by the ethical community and its reinforcing consequences. For example, it is a value if we find it reinforcing that someone else turned in a lost wallet that was yours, and that therefore we should turn in someone else's wallet. Rights and values overlap in everyday colloquial language as well as from the behavior analytic point of view. Are values beyond science? Activities that we consider as good tend to produce reinforcers, while activities that we consider bad tend to produce punishers. The functions of particular reinforcers or punishers are based on our social history. It's easier to determine our values when we take a look at how our behavior has evolved from our experiences. Should or ought statements are rooted in reinforcers and punishers. Such is the example of telling a roommate she ought to wear a coat because doing so has reinforcing consequences. Should and ought statements can be phrased as questions that ask about specific behavior under certain conditions. The scientific approach to addressing conflicting values in society, such as passing laws that allow or prohibit voluntary euthanasia, would involve examining other cultural values. Taking the heat out of arguments. In today's communication technologies and media, there seems to be a dispute about discussing rights and values, which often resorts to heated arguments that does not have a good resolution. One main behavioral approach to resolving discussions about values is for all members of the community to agree that values statements are learned verbal behavior. In order for there to be agreement amongst members that values statements are learned behavior, there needs to be further explanation, starting with that verbal behavior begins at a very young age, and that it is shaped by the verbal community. We then learn to tag things around us as well as our own actions and the actions of others. We can then move on to explaining the examples of verbal behavior that include statements of belief and conviction. Examples need to be provided to the participant so that they understand that verbal behavior isn't a physical aspect, but that it is behavior. It is important to note that you have to be alert on behavioral aspects of the problem so as to avoid mentalistic positions. Another important aspect is to focus on what influences the participant's statement about values and their history of reinforcement, so the discussion shifts to a more objective, scientific approach. The end goal is not to get everyone to agree with you, but to agree on how to address the behavioral questions and the criteria for making decisions. The example of whether death penalty should be considered an option for individuals convicted of a crime should result in discussions that include where the behavior originated, the influence of death penalty on possible criminal behavior, the possibility that innocent people may be wrongly put to death, and whether societal acceptance of the death penalty influences the treatment of such individuals that are viewed as less valuable members of society due to their position. It is important to consider your own views on the topic and then determine your approach, whether you are trying to win the other party by convincing them that you are right or convincing them that behavioral analysis is beneficial in resolving the issue at hand. Lastly, a behavior analyst should remain neutral when confronted with any issue concerning values. One must also consider all positions, even if it is in opposition to one's own viewpoint or opinion. By focusing on evidence that may be beneficial to resolving the issue, it may encourage others to be interested in the scientific pursuit of evidence, as well as encouraging agreement that this is how things should be done. My question is, what was your perspective on ethics, values, and rights? How has it changed after learning about ethics, values, and rights in this chapter?